The cameras may have stopped rolling for a moment, but the silence surrounding Meri and Janelle has been louder than ever, and now that silence is finally breaking. For years, viewers have watched the shifting dynamics, the quiet tension, the moments that felt like they held more meaning than what was actually said out loud. And through it all, Meri and Janelle often seemed like two people standing on opposite sides of an invisible line, rarely crossing it, rarely addressing it, but never truly escaping it either. But something has changed. It didn't happen overnight. It wasn't one dramatic argument or a single explosive moment. Instead, it's been building slowly, like pressure beneath the surface. The kind of pressure that comes from years of unspoken truths, unresolved conflict, and living in a situation that no longer fits who you've become. Meri, once seen as the foundation of the family, had long struggled with their place. There was a time when she held a position of authority, of closeness, of being the first. But over the years, that role seemed to fade. The emotional distance between her and Kody became impossible to ignore, and her connection to the rest of the family, especially Janelle, felt strained at best. Janelle, on the other hand, had always approached things differently. Practical, independent, often emotionally reserved, she carved out her own space within the family. She wasn't one to engage in confrontation, but that didn't mean she didn't feel it. Her silence often spoke volumes, especially when it came to her relationship with Meri. For a long time, it seemed like the two of them had simply accepted the distance. Not friends, not enemies, just coexisting. But coexistence can only last so long when everything around you is changing. And everything has changed. The family structure that once defined their lives has unraveled. The relationships that once held everything together have shifted, some breaking completely. And in the aftermath, there's been something unexpected: clarity. Meri has started to speak more openly, not just about her relationship with Kody, but about how she felt within the family as a whole. There's a different tone now, less guarded, more reflective. She's no longer trying to hold on to something that clearly wasn't holding on to her. And then there's Janelle. For years, she stayed steady, focused on her children, her independence, her sense of self. But even she has reached a point where silence no longer feels like the right choice. There's a quiet strength in the way she's beginning to open up, a willingness to acknowledge things that were once left unsaid. When Meri and Janelle finally begin to break that silence, it's not loud. It's not dramatic in the way people might expect, but it's powerful, because it's honest. There's an acknowledgement of the past, of the misunderstandings, the hurt, the distance that grew between them over the years. It's not about placing blame or rewriting history. It's about recognizing what was real, even if it was uncomfortable. Meri admits that she often felt isolated, not just from Kody, but from the family itself. There were moments when she didn't feel supported, when she questioned where she truly belonged. And while she doesn't say it outright, there's an understanding that some of that distance existed between her and Janelle. Janelle, in her own way, responds to that. She doesn't deny the distance. She doesn't pretend it wasn't there. But she offers a different perspective, one rooted in how she experienced those same years. For her, it wasn't about exclusion or intention. It was about survival within a complicated dynamic, about finding a way to exist without constant conflict. And maybe that's where the real shift begins. Because for the first time, they're not just speaking, they're listening. There's a moment, subtle but significant, where it feels like both of them are seeing each other clearly, not through the lens of the past, not through assumptions or old roles, but as they are now, two women who have lived through the same experience in very different ways. It doesn't erase everything that came before. It doesn't magically fix years of distance, but it opens the door to something new: understanding, and maybe even respect. What makes this moment so compelling isn't just what's being said, it's what it represents. The end of something old and the beginning of something uncertain but real. For so long, their relationship existed within the structure of the family. Now that structure is gone, or at least no longer the same, and without it, there's space to redefine things. There's no pressure to be close, no expectation to force a bond that doesn't come naturally, but there is an opportunity to move forward without the weight of everything that was left unsaid. Meri seems lighter in a way that's hard to ignore. There's a sense that she's no longer trying to prove her place, no longer holding on to something that wasn't giving back, and in that space, she's able to be more open, more honest. Janelle, too, appears more grounded. There's a confidence in her independence, a clarity in what she wants and what she doesn't,
And that clarity allows her to engage in a way that feels genuine, not forced. As they continue to talk, there are moments of tension, of course. You can't revisit years of complicated history without encountering that. But those moments don't escalate. They don't turn into the kind of conflict that once might have defined their interactions. Instead, they move through it, carefully, thoughtfully. And that in itself is something new. There's also an unspoken understanding that they're not just speaking for themselves. Their words carry weight, not just within their own relationship, but within the larger story that has played out in front of millions of viewers. People have watched, speculated, formed opinions about who was right, who was wrong. But this isn't about that. This is about two people finally telling their truth, in their own way, on their own terms. And maybe that's why it resonates so deeply, because it feels real. There's no script for this kind of conversation, no perfect way to say everything that needs to be said, but sometimes just starting the conversation is enough. As the silence continues to break, it becomes clear that this isn't just a moment, it's a turning point, not just for Meri and Janelle, but for the entire narrative that has surrounded them for so long. The story is no longer about a plural marriage trying to function against the odds. It's about individuals finding their own paths, their own voices, their own sense of peace. And in that journey, the relationship between Meri and Janelle becomes something different, not defined by the past, but shaped by the present. It's not perfect, it's not simple, but it's real. And for the first time in a long time, that feels like enough. For a long time, the space between Meri and Janelle felt like something permanent, like a quiet agreement that certain things would simply never be addressed. It wasn't spoken, but it was understood. There were boundaries, invisible but firm, built over years of shared experiences that never quite aligned the way they were supposed to. But now, as the silence begins to unravel, something unexpected happens. The conversation doesn't just continue, it deepens. Meri leans into it first, not with confrontation, but with a kind of honesty that feels overdue. There's no attempt to soften her words this time, no effort to protect the image of what the family once was. Instead, she begins to talk about the early years, about what it felt like when Janelle first entered the family, and how that moment shaped everything that came after. It's not an easy memory to revisit. There was confusion, she admits, a sense of displacement. She had been the only wife for a time, and then suddenly everything changed. The dynamic shifted overnight, and she didn't feel prepared for it. What she felt wasn't just jealousy, it was uncertainty, a loss of control in a life that had once felt predictable. Janelle listens quietly, not interrupting, not reacting immediately. It's clear she's heard versions of this before, maybe not as openly, but enough to recognize where it's coming from. Still, hearing it now, in this way, lands differently. When she finally responds, her voice is calm, but there's a weight behind it. She acknowledges that the beginning was complicated, maybe more than either of them fully understood at the time, but she also reveals something that hasn't been said this clearly before. She didn't feel like she belonged either. That admission shifts the tone, because for so long it may have seemed like Janelle entered the family with confidence, with purpose, with a clear understanding of her place. But according to her, that wasn't the reality. She was navigating something unfamiliar, trying to find her footing in a structure that already had its own history, its own emotional layers. And in that process, mistakes were made. Not intentionally, she insists, but inevitably. Meri absorbs that, and for a moment, there's silence again. But this silence feels different. It's not avoidance, it's processing. There's a realization beginning to form, one that neither of them may have fully acknowledged before, that they weren't just reacting to each other all those years ago. They were reacting to a situation that neither of them truly had control over. Still, that doesn't erase the impact. Meri begins to speak again, this time about the years that followed, about how small moments added up, conversations that didn't happen, feelings that were never addressed. She describes a growing distance, one that became easier to maintain than to challenge. It just became normal, she says, almost more to herself than to Janelle. Not talking, not dealing with it, just existing around each other. Janelle nods because she recognizes that pattern. In many ways, she helped create it, not out of malice, but out of necessity. For her, avoidance conflict was a way to keep things stable, to keep the family functioning. But stability came at a cost. There were times I probably should have said something, Janelle admits, but I didn't want to make things worse, so I stayed quiet. That honesty lands heavily, because it reflects something both of them experienced, just in different ways. Silence wasn't just a gap between them, it was a strategy, a coping mechanism, and now they're confronting what that silence created. There's a moment where the conversation turns more personal, more direct. Meri asks a question that feels like it's been waiting for years to be spoken. Did you ever actually want a relationship with me? It's not accusatory, but it's raw. Janelle doesn't answer immediately. She takes a breath, choosing her words carefully. And when she speaks, it's with a level of clarity that suggests she's thought about this before. I think I wanted it to be easier than it was, she says, but I didn't always know how to make that happen. And after a while, I stopped trying. It's not the answer Meri might have hoped for, but it's an honest one. And strangely, that honesty creates space instead of closing it. Because for so long, they may have been speaking in half-truths or careful phrasing. They're saying what actually happened, even if it's uncomfortable. Meri nods slowly, takes a breath in. There's a flicker of something, disappointment maybe, but also understanding. Because if she's being honest with herself, she knows she stopped trying to. I think I did the same thing, she admits. At some point, it just felt like, what's the point? And that shared acknowledgement becomes a turning point. Not because it fixes anything, but because it aligns their experiences in a way that hasn't happened before. They weren't just distant, they were both choosing that distance, even if they didn't realize it at the time. From there, the conversation shifts again, this time toward the later years, the period when the cracks in the family became impossible to ignore. Meri talks about feeling increasingly isolated, not just from Janelle, but from everyone. She describes moments where she felt like an outsider in her own family, where the connection she once had with Kody had all but disappeared. Janelle listens, and while she doesn't interrupt, there's a subtle change in her expression, because while her experience was different, she recognizes that feeling of disconnection. I didn't see all of that at the time, Janelle admits, but looking back, I can understand it. It's not an apology exactly, but it's a form of validation, and sometimes that's just as important. As the conversation continues, there's a growing sense that both of them are starting to let go of something, not just the past itself, but the way they've held on to it. There's less defensiveness now, less need to explain or justify. Instead, there's a quiet acceptance of what was, of what wasn't, and of what can't be changed. But even in that acceptance, there's a question lingering beneath the surface. What happens now? Because breaking the silence is one thing, but deciding what to do with what comes after, that's something else entirely. Meri seems to be thinking the same thing. She shifts slightly, her tone softening. I don't know what this looks like going forward, she says. I'm not expecting us to suddenly be close or anything like that, but I also don't want things to stay the way they were. Janelle considers that carefully, and when she responds, there's a sense of openness that wasn't there before. I don't either, she says, but I think maybe it starts with just not avoiding each other anymore. It's a simple idea, but it carries weight, because for so long, avoidance defined their relationship, and now they're choosing something different. It's not a grand resolution.
As the weight of everything they've already said settles in, there's a noticeable shift in the energy between them. It's quieter now, not in a tense or avoidant way, but in a reflective one. The kind of silence that comes after something important has been spoken, when both people are trying to process not just what they heard, but what it means moving forward. Meri seems to sit with it for a moment longer before speaking again, her voice softer this time, but more certain. There's less hesitation now, like crossing that initial barrier has made the rest a little easier. I think one of the hardest parts for me, she begins, was feeling like I didn't matter anymore. Not just in the big picture, but in the day-to-day things. Decisions, conversations, it was like I just slowly stopped being included. She's not looking directly at Janelle when she says it, but the words are clearly meant for her to hear. Janelle exhales slowly, her expression thoughtful. There's no defensiveness in her reaction, just a kind of recognition that maybe this is something she didn't fully see at the time. I can understand why it felt that way, she says carefully, but I don't think I realized how much it was happening. I was so focused on my own space, my own kids, my own responsibilities, I think I just assumed everyone else was doing the same. That admission carries a quiet honesty. It doesn't dismiss Meri's experience, but it also reveals something important about Janelle, her tendency to compartmentalize, to focus inward rather than outward when things get complicated. Meri nods slightly, acknowledging that perspective, and for a moment it feels like they're not opposing each other. They're simply explaining the different ways they moved through the same reality. But that's the thing, Meri continues. We were all doing that. Everyone kind of pulled into their own world, and somewhere in that, we stopped being a family in the way we used to be. That statement hangs in the air because it speaks to something bigger than just the two of them. It's not just about their relationship. It's about the unraveling of the entire structure they were part of. Janelle doesn't argue with that. In fact, she nods in agreement, which in itself feels significant. Yeah, she says quietly, I think that's true. There's a pause, but it doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like acknowledgement. For years, the narrative may have been that the family was evolving, adapting, changing. But what they're both recognizing now is that in many ways, it was also breaking apart, slowly, subtly, until it became impossible to ignore. Meri doesn't argue with that. In fact, she nods in agreement, which in itself feels significant. Yeah, she says quietly, I think that's true. There's a pause, but it doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like acknowledgement. For years, the narrative may have been that the family was evolving, adapting, changing. But what they're both recognizing now is that in many ways, it was also breaking apart, slowly, subtly, until it became impossible to ignore. Meri shifts slightly, her posture more relaxed now, but her expression still serious. Do you ever think about how different things could have been, she asks, if we had handled things differently back then? It's a complicated question, one that doesn't have a simple answer. Janelle takes her time before responding, her gaze thoughtful. Sometimes, she admits, but I also think we were working with what we knew at the time, and maybe we didn't know how to do it better. It's not a dismissal of regret, but it's also not an attempt to rewrite the past. It's a recognition that hindsight doesn't always translate into something actionable. Meri considers that, and there's a small, almost imperceptible nod, because deep down, she knows there's truth in it. They didn't have the tools, the communication, or maybe even the willingness to address things differently back then. Still, that doesn't mean the impact wasn't real. I just wish we had talked more,
Meri says. Even if it was messy, even if it didn't fix anything, at least it would have been honest. Janelle's response is immediate this time, almost instinctive. I wish that too. And that shared regret creates another moment of alignment between them. Not because it changes anything, but because it shows that despite everything, they're not as far apart in their reflections as they might have thought. The conversation gradually begins to shift toward the period when everything started becoming more public, when the cameras were no longer just documenting a lifestyle, but capturing the cracks within it. Meri speaks about how that added another layer of complexity. It wasn't just about dealing with issues internally anymore. There was an awareness that everything could be seen, interpreted, judged. It made me more guarded, she admits, like I had to be careful about what I said, how I said it, even what I felt. Janelle nods, understanding that pressure in her own way. I think I went the opposite direction. I just shut down more, kept things to myself even more than I already did. That contrast is telling. Meri became more cautious, more controlled in how she expressed herself. Janelle became more withdrawn, more internal, and in that difference, the distance between them only grew. It's kind of ironic, Meri says, with a faint, almost self-aware smile. We were both reacting to the same thing, but in completely different ways. Janelle lets out a small breath of agreement. Yeah, and neither of those ways really helped. There's no bitterness in her tone, just clarity, and that clarity seems to open the door for something else. Not just reflection, but a kind of release, because for the first time, they're not just talking about what happened, they're understanding why it happened. The conversation takes another turn, this time toward how things stand now, not in terms of the past, but in terms of who they've become and outside of it. Meri talks about finding independence in a way she didn't expect, about learning to make decisions without waiting for approval, without wondering how it fits into a larger structure. There's something freeing about it, she says. Scary sometimes, but freeing. Janelle relates to that, though her journey looks different. I think I've always had a level of independence, she says, but now it feels more intentional, like I'm choosing it, not just falling into it. That distinction matters, because for both of them, this isn't just about leaving something behind, it's about actively building something new. And in that process, their relationship becomes less about what it used to be and more about what it could be, if anything at all. Meri seems to circle back to that idea, her tone thoughtful. I don't know if we'll ever be close, she says honestly, and I'm okay with that, but I do think we can have some kind of understanding, maybe even respect. Janelle nods, meeting her gaze this time. I think we're already starting to have that. It's a simple statement, but it carries weight, because respect doesn't require closeness. It doesn't require shared experiences or constant interaction. It just requires recognition of each other's perspective, each other's journey. And that's exactly what's happening here. As the conversation continues, there's less focus on the past conflicts and more on the present reality. The tension that wants to define their interactions has softened, not disappeared, but no longer dominant. There's even a moment of quiet humor, something that would have felt unlikely not too long ago, a shared acknowledgement of how complicated everything was, and how, in some ways, it still is. It's not laughter that erases the past, it's laughter that coexists with it. And maybe that's another sign of how things are changing. They're no longer trying to resolve everything in one conversation. They're not forcing a resolution that doesn't feel genuine. Instead, they're allowing things to unfold naturally. There's an understanding that this conversation, this openness, is just a starting point, not an ending, not a conclusion, just a different direction. And as that realization settles in, there's a sense of something quietly powerful taking shape. Not a reconciliation in the traditional sense, but a redefinition of who they are, of what they mean to each other, and of how they move forward from here. It's not dramatic, it's not perfect, but it's real. And for both of them, that seems to matter more than anything else. There's a point where the conversation begins to feel less like a confrontation with the past and more like an exploration of everything that came after it. The intensity softens, not because the topics become easier, but because both of them seem more grounded in who they are now. There's less urgency to prove a point, less need to defend old decisions. Instead, there's a quiet curiosity about each other, about themselves, about how everything unfolded the way it did. Meri is the one who shifts the direction again, her voice thoughtful, almost reflective in a way that suggests she's been carrying these thoughts for a long time. I think for a while I was waiting, she says, waiting for things to go back to how they were, or at least something closer to that. Janelle watches her closely, not interrupting, but clearly engaged. And I held on to that for longer than I probably should have, Meri continues, even when it was obvious things weren't the same anymore. There's no self-pity in her tone, just honesty. Janelle nods slowly, understanding more than she might have in the past. I don't think I ever expected things to go back, she admits. Once things started shifting, I just adapted. That's kind of how I've always handled things. That difference between them becomes more apparent in this moment than ever before. Meri held on, hoping for restoration. Janelle adjusted, accepting change as it came. Neither approach was right or wrong, but they led to very different experiences. I think that's where we were out of sync, Meri says. I was still trying to fix something that you had already moved on from. Janelle considers that, then gives a small, thoughtful nod. Yeah, that sounds accurate. There's no tension in the acknowledgement, just clarity, and that clarity seems to make everything else easier to talk about. Meri shifts slightly, her tone becoming more introspective. It's strange, though, she adds, because when I look back, I don't even know what I was trying to fix exactly. The relationship, the family, or just the idea of what it was supposed to be. That question lingers, not necessarily needing an answer, but opening up a deeper layer of understanding. Janelle responds carefully, choosing her words with intention. I think sometimes we hold on to the idea more than the reality, she says, because the idea feels safer. It's predictable. It's what we expected things to be. Meri lets out a quiet breath, as if that resonates more than she expected. Yeah, that makes sense. There's a brief pause, but it doesn't feel heavy. It feels like both of them are absorbing something important, not just about the past, but about themselves. The conversation then begins to drift into territory that feels more personal, less about the shared structure they were part of, and more about how each of them navigated life within it. Meri talks about the loneliness she experienced, especially in the later years. Not just physical loneliness, but emotional distance, feeling like she was present but not truly connected. I felt invisible, she says quietly, like I could be there or not be there, and it wouldn't really change anything. Janelle's expression softens at that, and for a moment there's a hint of something deeper, empathy that maybe wasn't fully accessible before. I'm sorry you felt that way, she says, and it's simple, but it's sincere. Thank you, Meri replies, equally simple. It's a small exchange, but it carries weight, because sometimes acknowledgement is more powerful than explanation. Janelle then shifts the focus slightly, offering her own perspective in a way that feels more open than before. I think I avoided a lot of that by staying busy, she admits, focusing on work, on the kids. It gave me a sense of purpose, but looking back, I can see that I was probably avoiding things too. That admission creates another moment of balance between them. They weren't just reacting differently, they were coping differently.
Even after everything that's been said, there's a lingering sense that the conversation isn't quite finished, not because something is missing, but because certain truths take time to fully surface. And as both of them sit with what's already been shared, there's a natural pull toward the deeper layers, the things that weren't always visible, even to themselves. Meri is the first to break the quiet again, but this time her tone carries something slightly different. There's a vulnerability there that feels less guarded than before, as if the earlier conversation has created enough trust to go a step further. I think I spent a long time trying to understand where I went wrong, she admits. Like, if I could just figure that out, maybe everything else would make more sense. Janelle listens carefully, her expression neutral but attentive. And I kept coming back to the same question, Meri continues. Was it something I did, or was it just the way things were always going to turn out? It's a question that doesn't have a clean answer, and both of them seem to know that. Janelle takes a slow breath before responding. I don't think it was just one thing, she says, and I don't think it was all on you either. I think it was a lot of small things over a long time. That perspective feels balanced, not placing blame, that not avoiding reality either. Meri nods, though there's still a trace of something unresolved in her expression. I guess that's what makes it harder, she says. If it had been one big thing, at least it would be clear. But when it's a bunch of little things, it just kind of builds. Janelle agrees with that quietly, because she's seen it happen, not just in their relationship, but across the entire family. Yeah, she says, and sometimes you don't even notice it building until it's already too big to ignore. That idea seems to resonate deeply, because for both of them, that's exactly what happened. The distance didn't appear suddenly, it grew slowly, almost invisibly, until it became the defining feature of their relationship. The conversation then shifts into something more introspective, almost philosophical in a way. It's no longer just about what happened between them, but about how they've processed it individually. Meri reflects on how her identity was tied to the family for so long, how her role within it shaped the way she saw herself. When that started to fall apart, she says, I didn't just lose the relationship, I lost a part of who I thought I was. Janelle nods, understanding that in her own way, even if her experience was different. I think we all did, she admits, even if it looked different for each of us. That acknowledgement expands the scope of the conversation again. It's not just about two people, it's about a shared experience that affected everyone involved, even if they responded to it in different ways. Meri leans into that thought. It's strange, though, she says, because I don't think I realized how much I was holding on to that identity until I didn't have it anymore. Janelle offers a small, thoughtful smile.
sometimes you don't realize how much something defines you until it's gone. There's a quiet agreement in that, a mutual understanding that doesn't need further explanation. But then the conversation takes a slightly more direct turn, one that brings things back to the space between them. Meri hesitates for just a second before asking something that feels important. "Do you think we ever really understood each other?" she asks. It's not a rhetorical question. It's genuine. Janelle considers it carefully, her expression thoughtful. "I think we understood parts of each other," she says, "but not the whole picture." That answer feels honest, even if it's not entirely satisfying. Meri nods slowly. "Yeah, that sounds about right." There's no frustration in her tone, just acceptance. Because at this point, the goal doesn't seem to be rewriting the past or finding perfect answers. It's about recognizing what was real, even if it wasn't complete. Janelle then adds something that shifts the perspective slightly. "But I think we understand each other better now than we did back then," she says. Meri looks at her, a hint of curiosity in her expression. "Why do you think that is?" she asks. Janelle pauses, choosing her words carefully. "Because we're not trying to fit into the same structure anymore," she explains. "Back then, everything was filtered through the family dynamic, through roles, expectations, all of that. Now it's just us as individuals." That insight lands in a meaningful way, because it highlights something that's been present throughout the conversation but hasn't been explicitly stated until now. The idea that their relationship was never just about the two of them. It was shaped, influenced, and sometimes restricted by the larger system they were part of. And now, without that system, there's space to see each other differently. Meri seems to recognize that as well. "That makes sense," she says. "It's like we're meeting each other for the first time in a way." Janelle nods slightly. "Yeah," she says, "without all the layers." There's something almost hopeful in that realization, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, grounded sense, because it suggests that whatever comes next isn't bound by what came before. The conversation begins to explore that idea more directly, what it means to move forward without the weight of old expectations. Meri speaks about wanting simplicity. "Not everything has to be complicated," she says. "I think I made things more complicated in my head than they needed to be." Janelle responds with a small, knowing smile. "I think we all did, at some point," she says. There's a shared acknowledgement there, one that feels lighter than the earlier parts of the conversation. And that lightness seems to carry through as they begin to talk about what they actually want now, not in abstract terms, but in practical ones. Meri keeps it simple. "I just want peace," she says. "In my life, in my relationships, just peace." Janelle nods immediately. "Same. That's really all I'm looking for, too." It's a straightforward answer, but it feels significant. Because for so long, their lives were defined by complexity, by navigating a structure that required constant adjustment, compromise, and emotional negotiation. And now they're both choosing something different. Not excitement, not intensity, just peace. The conversation slows again, but this time it doesn't feel like there's anything left unsaid. It feels like everything that needed to come up has found its way into the open, in its own time, in its own way. There's no dramatic resolution waiting at the end of this, no sudden transformation of their relationship into something it's never been. But there is something else. Clarity, respect, and a sense that whatever comes next doesn't have to carry the weight of everything that came before. Meri looks at Janelle again, her expression calm, almost steady in a way that feels new. "I don't regret talking about this, even if it's not perfect." Janelle meets her gaze with the same level of calm. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be real. And that, more than anything else, seems to define this moment. Not perfection, not resolution, just reality, finally acknowledged, finally spoken, and finally understood in a way that allows both of them to move forward without pretending, without avoiding, and without carrying more than they need to anymore. There's something noticeably different now, not just in what they're saying, but in how they're sitting with each other. The tension that once filled the space between them has thinned out, replaced by something quieter, more neutral. Not warm in a familiar sense, but not cold either. It's a kind of calm that doesn't demand anything, and maybe that's why it feels so unfamiliar. Meri seems to notice it too. "It's strange though," she says after a moment, almost half to herself. "This doesn't feel like what I expected." Janelle glances at her, curious but not surprised. "What did you expect?" she asks. Meri exhales softly, thinking about it. "I don't know, something more uncomfortable, I guess, or more emotional, like everything would come rushing out all at once." Janelle nods slightly, considering that. "Yeah," she says, "I can see that. But I think we already went through most of that part, just not together." That observation lands in a quiet but powerful way, because it's true. So much of the emotional weight, the anger, the confusion, the disappointment, was processed separately, over time, in different ways. And now what's left isn't the raw intensity of those feelings, but the understanding that came after them. Meri shifts slightly, her posture more open than before. I think if we had tried to have this conversation years ago, it would have been completely different. Janelle lets out a small breath of agreement. Oh, definitely, she says. I don't think either of us would have been ready for it. Meri nods, a faint, knowing smile appearing for just a second. Yeah, it probably would have turned into an argument. There's a hint of humor in that, and for the first time Janelle actually lets out a quiet laugh. Probably, she agrees. It's a small moment, but it matters. Not because it changes anything significant, but because it shows that they can acknowledge the past without being pulled back into it. That alone is a shift. The conversation moves forward again, but now it feels less like they're trying to uncover something, and more like they're trying to understand what this new version of their dynamic actually looks like. Janelle leans slightly forward, her tone thoughtful. Do you think we ever would have gotten here and everything stayed the same? She asks. Janelle considers that question carefully. No, she says after a moment. I don't think so. I think we needed everything to change, even if it was messy. Janelle nods slightly, agreeing with that more than she might have expected. Yeah, she says. I think you're right. There's something almost paradoxical about that realization, that the breakdown of the family, as difficult as it was, created the space for this kind of clarity, that without that shift, they might have stayed in the same patterns indefinitely. Meri seems to follow that thought a little further. It's weird to think about how something that felt like an ending is actually what made this possible. Janelle's response is quiet but certain. Sometimes endings are the only way things actually change. That statement lingers for a moment, not heavy, but meaningful, because it reframes everything. Not as a failure, but as a transition. And maybe that's something both of them are still learning to accept. The conversation then drifts into a more reflective space again, but this time it feels less about the past and more about perspective, how they see things now compared to how they saw them then. Meri speaks first, her tone steady. I used to take everything so personally, she admits. Every little thing felt like it meant something bigger. Janelle nods, understanding that tendency, even if it wasn't her own. And now, she asks. She shrugs slightly, but there's a calm confidence in the gesture. Now I realize that not everything was about me. People were dealing with their own stuff, making their own choices. It wasn't always connected to me, even if it felt like it was. Janelle considers that, then gives a small nod. That's a hard shift to make, but it changes everything when you do. Meri smiles faintly. Not in a dramatic way, but in quiet acknowledgement. Yeah, it really does. Janelle then reflects on her own side of things, her tone equally introspective. I think for me, I got so used to being independent that I didn't always consider how that affected other people. I just assumed everyone was responsible for their own space, their own feelings. Janelle listens closely, and there's no judgment in her expression, just curiosity. And now, she asks? Janelle pauses for a moment, thinking it through. Now I think I understand.
There's a subtle shift again, but this time it isn't driven by anything either of them says right away. It's in the way they sit, the way the pauses stretch just a little longer without feeling uncomfortable. The conversation has moved beyond explanation, beyond clarification. It's settling into something quieter, something that feels less like resolving the past and more like understanding the present. Meri breaks the silence, but her voice is softer now, almost reflective in a way that suggests she's thinking out loud as much as she's speaking to Janelle. I think for a long time, I didn't trust my own instincts, she says, like I kept second-guessing how I felt or telling myself I was overreacting. Janelle looks at her, listening closely, not interrupting. And I think that made everything harder, Meri continues, because instead of addressing things when they happened, I just push it down, try to convince myself it wasn't a big deal. Janelle nods slowly, absorbing that. That sounds exhausting, she says. Meri lets out a small, almost tired laugh. It was, she admits. And the worst part is, it didn't actually make anything better. It just delayed everything. Janelle leans back slightly, her expression thoughtful. I think I did something similar, she says, just in a different way. Instead of questioning my feelings, I kind of ignored them. Meri glances at her, curious. I didn't really sit with things, Janelle explains. If something felt uncomfortable, I'd just move past it, focus on something else. Meri nods, seeing the connection. So we were both avoiding things, she says, just in completely different ways. Janelle gives a small, knowing smile. Yeah, she says, pretty much. That realization doesn't feel heavy anymore. It feels almost clarifying, like they're finally seeing the patterns that shaped their dynamic, not with frustration, but with understanding. The conversation drifts into a more introspective space again, But now it's less about what happened between them and more about how they've changed because of it. Meri speaks first, her tone steady. I don't think I'm the same person I was back then, she says. Not even close. Janelle nods immediately. Me neither, she says. There's no hesitation in that agreement. Meri continues, a little more certain now. I used to define myself by where I fit in the family, she says. Like my value came from my role, my relationships, all of that. Janelle listens, her expression neutral but engaged. And now, she asks. Meri pauses, but it's not uncertainty, it's consideration. Now I think I'm still figuring that out, she says, but it feels more personal, like it's about what I want, not just where I belong. Janelle nods, understanding that shift. That's a big change, she says, going from being part of something like that to standing on your own. Meri gives a small nod. Yeah, she says, it is, but I think I needed it. Janelle takes that in, then reflects on her own experience. I think I always had a bit of that independence, she says, but even then I was still operating within the structure, still making choices based on how everything fit together. Meri watches her, listening closely. And now it's different, Janelle adds, because I don't have to factor all of that in anymore. It's just my life. There's something grounding in the way she says it. Not dramatic, not overly emotional, just clear. Meri smiles faintly. That sounds peaceful, she says. Janelle returns the smile, small but genuine. It is, she says, most of the time. There's a brief moment of shared understanding there, an acknowledgement that peace isn't constant, but it's something they both value now in a way they didn't before. The conversation shifts slightly again, this time towards something more subtle, how they perceive each other now, in this new context. Meri seems to hesitate for just a second before speaking, but when she does, her tone is calm. I think I see you differently now, she says. Janelle raises her eyebrows slightly, not defensive, just curious. How? She asks. Meri takes a moment to find the right words. I think before I saw you as distant, like you were intentionally keeping space, and I took that personally. Janelle listens, her expression steady. But now, Meri continues, I think that's just how you are. It's not about shutting people out, it's just how you manage things. Janelle nods slowly, appreciating that distinction. Yeah, that's pretty accurate. There's no need for further explanation. The understanding is enough. Janelle then offers her own perspective, her tone equally measured. I think I saw you as more reactive, she says, like things affected you quickly and deeply, and I didn't always know how to respond to that. Meri considers that, then nods. That's fair, she says. I think that's true. There's no defensiveness in her response, just acceptance. And I think that's part of why we didn't connect, Janelle adds. We handled things so differently that it was hard to meet in the middle. Meri nods again. Yeah, that makes sense. That exchange feels important, not because it reveals something new, but because it reframes what they already knew. Their differences weren't necessarily the problem, it was the lack of understanding around those differences. And now, that understanding is starting to take shape. The conversation softens again, moving into a quieter, more reflective tone. Meri glances down for a moment, then back at Janelle. I don't think we ever gave ourselves the chance to understand each other like this. Janelle agrees without hesitation. No, she says. There's a brief pause, but it doesn't feel like something is missing. It feels like something has been acknowledged. And sometimes that's enough. Meri leans back slightly, her posture relaxed. But I'm glad we're doing it now, she adds. Janelle nods, her expression calm. Me too, she says. There's no big emotional moment, no dramatic shift, just a steady, grounded sense that something meaningful is happening. Not in a way that demands attention, but in a way that quietly changes things. The conversation continues, but it feels less structured now, less like they're working through something and more like they're simply talking, openly, honestly, without the weight that once defined their interactions. And in that simplicity, there's something unexpectedly significant, because for the first time, it's not about the past. It's not about the tension, the distance, or the unresolved questions. It's just two people sitting across from each other, having a conversation that feels real. And maybe that's the most important shift of all. As the conversation continues, there's a noticeable sense that neither of them is trying to steer it anymore. It moves naturally, almost effortlessly, like they've both reached a point where there's no need to control what comes next. And in that openness, something deeper begins to surface. Not conflict, not even resolution, but perspective in a way that feels more complete. Meri is the one who leans into that shift, her voice thoughtful, almost reflective of something she's only recently begun to understand. I think for a long time, I needed things to be defined, she says, like I needed to know exactly where I stood, what everything meant,
Otherwise, it felt unstable. Janelle listens, her expression calm but attentive. And when I didn't have that, Meri continues, I would try to fill in the gaps myself, make assumptions, try to piece things together in a way that made sense to me. Janelle nods slowly. I can see that, she says. And I think I did the opposite. Meri glances at her, curious. I didn't need things to be defined, Janelle explains. In fact, I think I avoided defining things, because once you define something, you have to deal with it. Meri lets out a quiet breath, recognizing the contrast. So I was trying to create clarity, she says, and you were trying to avoid it. Janelle gives a small, almost amused nod. Yeah, she says, which probably made things even more confusing for both of us. There's a lightness in that realization, not because it's funny, but because it finally makes sense. The push and pull between clarity and avoidance, definition and distance, it created a dynamic that neither of them fully understood at the time. Meri leans back slightly, her posture relaxed. It's interesting though, she adds, because now I feel like I don't need that same level of definition anymore. Janelle tilts her head slightly. No, she asks. Meri shakes her head gently. No, she says. I think I've realized that not everything needs a label or a clear explanation to exist. Some things can just be what they are. Janelle considers that, then nods. That's a big shift, especially if you're used to needing that clarity. Meri smiles faintly. Yeah, she says, but it feels better, less pressure. That idea seems to resonate with Janelle as well, though from a different angle. I think I'm kind of moving in the opposite direction, she admits. Not in a bad way, but I think I'm learning that sometimes it's okay to actually define things, to be more clear about where I stand. Meri looks at her, interested. So we're meeting in the middle, she says. Janelle smiles slightly. Yeah, she says. I guess we are. That moment feels quietly significant, not because it changes anything immediately, but because it reflects growth on both sides. They're not just understanding each other better, they're adjusting in ways that make that understanding possible. The conversation shifts again, this time towards something that feels more reflective of how others may have perceived their relationship over the years. Meri brings it up carefully. Do you ever think about how people saw us? Watching everything from the outside? Janelle exhales softly, considering the question. Sometimes, she says, but I don't think anyone really saw the full picture. Meri nods in agreement. Yeah, she says. I think people filled in a lot of blanks based on what they thought they understood. Janelle adds to that, her tone steady. And I think we did that too, she says. Even with each other. That observation lands with quiet clarity. Because it's not just about how they were perceived, it's about how they perceived each other. The assumptions, the interpretations, the meanings they assign to each other's actions without fully understanding them. Meri lets that settle for a moment. I think I told myself a lot of stories about why things were the way they were, she admits, and I believed them because I didn't have anything else to go on. Janelle nods, recognizing that pattern. Yeah, and once you believe something like that, it's hard to see anything outside of it. Meri agrees. Exactly, she says. It kind of becomes your reality, even if it's not completely accurate. That realization doesn't feel heavy anymore. It feels freeing. Because recognizing that those interpretations weren't absolute opens the door to seeing things differently. The conversation moves into a more grounded space again, focusing less on interpretation and more on intention. Janelle speaks this time, her tone calm but direct. I don't think I ever intended to create distance, but I can see now how my actions probably did. Meri listens, her expression open. And I don't think I intended to make things more intense, I respond, but I can see how that might have been overwhelming at times. Janelle gives a small nod. Yeah, that's fair. There's something balanced about that exchange. No blame, no defensiveness, just acceptance. And that balance seems to create something else, something lighter. Meri lets out a small...
The atmosphere between them has shifted into something even more subtle now, less like a conversation that's being carefully navigated, and more like two people who no longer feel the need to guard every word. There's still awareness, still reflection, but the edges have softened in a way that makes the space feel less heavy. Meri breaks the silence first, but this time her tone carries something more grounded, almost like she's speaking from a place of acceptance rather than analysis. I think one of the things I struggled with the most, she says, was feeling like I had to justify my feelings all the time. Janelle looks at her, attentive, not interrupting. Like if I was upset or hurt, I had to prove why it was valid, Meri continues. Otherwise, it would just be dismissed or minimized. There's no accusation in her voice, just a reflection of how it felt from her perspective. Janelle nods slowly, taking that in. I can understand that, she says after a moment, and I think I probably wasn't always as aware of that as I should have been. Meri acknowledges that with a small nod, not pressing further, but not letting it disappear either. Janelle continues, her tone steady. I think for me, if something didn't feel directly connected to me, I sometimes assumed it wasn't something I needed to step into, she says. But I can see now how that might have felt like distance. Meri listens carefully, then responds with quiet honesty. Yeah, she says, it did. There's a pause, but it's not uncomfortable. It's reflective. Both of them seem to be sitting with the idea that impact doesn't always require intention, that absence can be just as loud as action, even if it wasn't meant that way. Janelle exhales softly. I think I was more comfortable with emotional space, she admits, like not being in the middle of everything, but I can see how that might have left you feeling alone in it at times. Meri's expression softens slightly at that, not because it changes the past, but because it acknowledges it in a way that feels sincere. I don't think I ever fully understood that about you back then, she says. I just saw it as distance, not as your way of handling things. Janelle nods. And I don't think I fully understood how much you needed engagement, she replies, or reassurance. I think I underestimated that. That mutual recognition creates a quiet shift. It's not about blame anymore, it's about awareness. Each of them is starting to see not just what happened, but why it may have felt the way it did on the other side. Meri leans slightly forward, her voice more reflective again. I used to think that if I explained things well enough, people would understand me, she says. But I don't think it works like that, not always. Janelle tilts her head slightly, considering that. No, she agrees. I don't think it does. I think people interpret things through their own lens more than anything else. Meri nods, accepting that. Yeah, she says, and I think I didn't realize how different our lenses were. That statement lingers for a moment, because it quietly summarizes so much of what they've been unpacking. Different lenses, same experiences, different interpretations. And somewhere in between those differences, misunderstandings formed, not out of malice, but out of perspective. The conversation drifts again, this time towards something more introspective about growth. Janelle speaks first. I think I've learned that I don't need to react to everything, she says, that not every situation requires my involvement or response. Meri listens, then responds with a small nod. And I think I've learned that staying silent doesn't always protect peace, she says. Sometimes it just delays things that need to be addressed. There's a quiet symmetry in those two realizations, almost like they're balancing each other out. Janelle acknowledges that with a faint smile. Yeah, she says, I can see that. Meri smiles slightly as well. We probably could have used this version of ourselves a long time ago, she says. Janelle lets out a soft breath, almost amused. Probably, she agrees, but I don't think we had it then. That statement doesn't carry regret. It carries acceptance. Because growth, in their case, didn't happen in time to change the past. It happened afterward, when it was no longer about fixing things, but about understanding them. Meri leans back slightly, her posture relaxed. I don't feel angry about it anymore, almost surprising herself with the admission. Not in the way I used to. Janelle looks at her, attentive. What do you feel instead? She asks. Meri pauses, thinking about it honestly. Mostly clarity, she says, and maybe a little sadness, but not the kind that weighs me down. Janelle nods slowly. That makes sense, she says. I think I feel something similar. Just acceptance of how it all unfolded. There's a shared recognition there again. Not identical emotions, but aligned understanding. The conversation grows quieter again, but this time it feels like a natural pause rather than an ending point. Meri glances towards Janelle, her expression calm. I don't think we owe each other anymore, she says. Not explanations, not apologies, not anything like that. Janelle meets her gaze evenly. No, she agrees. I don't think we do either. That exchange feels significant, not because it closes a chapter, but because it removes pressure from it. No more expectations, no more unresolved obligations, just two people acknowledging that what needed to be said has been said, and what remains doesn't need to be forced into anything specific. There's a long pause after that, but it's not empty. It's full in a different way. Like both of them are quietly registering what this moment means without needing to define it out loud. Finally, Janelle speaks again, her tone calm but steady. I think this is probably enough for today, she says gently. Meri nods immediately, no resistance in her expression. Yeah, she agrees. I think it is. There's no abrupt ending, no emotional rupture, just a natural conclusion to something that unfolded honestly. They don't stand on dramatic terms. They don't leave as completely transformed versions of themselves. But they do leave with something that wasn't there before.
understanding without tension, clarity without conflict, and a sense that whatever comes next doesn't have to be defined by what came before. There's a quiet stillness that settles in after those final words, one that doesn't feel awkward or unfinished, but complete in a way that neither of them rushes to disrupt. It's the kind of silence that comes when something important has naturally reached its limit, not because it was forced to end, but because it has said what it needed to say. Meri is the first to move slightly, not physically leaving the moment, but shifting out of the intensity of it. Her expression is calm now, more settled than it was at the beginning of this entire exchange. "I didn't expect this to feel like this," she says softly. Janelle looks at her, waiting, not assuming what she means. Meri continues after a brief pause. "I thought it would feel heavier, or more complicated, but it actually feels lighter than I expected." Janelle nods slowly, taking that in. "Yeah, I know what you mean." There's a faint understanding between them now that doesn't require explanation. They both seem to recognize that the weight they expected was already carried long before this conversation ever began, and what's left now is simply the result of finally setting some of it down. Meri glances down for a moment, then back up. "I think I spent so long preparing for conversations like this to go badly," she admits, "that I never really considered what it would feel like if they didn't." Janelle gives a small, thoughtful smile. "Same," she says. "I think I always assumed things would get tense if we went too deep into anything." That acknowledgement sits quietly between them, not as a surprise, but as a shared realization of how much expectation shaped their distance. Meri exhales gently. "And instead, it just feels normal," she says, in a strange way. Janelle nods again, her expression calm. "Maybe that's what it was supposed to be all along," she says. "Just normal conversation, without everything attached to it." That idea lingers for a moment, because it reframes everything they've just experienced, not as something dramatic or transformative in a visible way, but as something simple that had been complicated by everything surrounding it. Meri smiles faintly at that. "Yeah," she says. "Maybe." There's a pause again, but this time it feels final in a peaceful way. Not a cliff, not an ending with unresolved tension, but a natural resting point. Janelle shifts slightly, her tone steady but warm in its own understanding way. "I'm glad we did this," she says, "even if it took a long time to get here." Meri meets her gaze, and for the first time in a while, there's no emotional friction in her expression, just sincerity. "Me too," she says. "I think I needed it more than I realized." Janelle nods, accepting that without adding anything to it. Because it doesn't need expansion anymore. The conversation has done what it came to do. Not fix everything, not rewrite the past, but bring clarity to something that had been unclear for too long. Meri glances down briefly, as if taking in the moment itself, then back at Janelle. "I don't think everything changes after this," she says honestly, "but I think how I think about it changes." Janelle agrees quietly. "Yeah, I think that's enough." That simplicity carries more weight than anything elaborate could, because neither of them is looking for transformation anymore. Just understanding. Just peace. Meri lets out a soft breath, then gives a small nod. "Okay," she says, almost like a quiet acknowledgement to herself as much as to Janelle. Janelle responds with the same calmness. "Okay," she echoes. And in that shared simplicity, there's no need for anything else. No final resolution to be declared. No dramatic closure to be performed. Just two people who have finally said what needed to be said, heard what needed to be heard, and reached a point where silence no longer feels like avoidance, but completion. Meri stands slowly, without urgency. Janelle follows a moment later. There's no lingering hesitation, no unresolved glance that pulls them back in. Just a natural ending. Not to their relationship, but to this moment within it. And as they separate, not dramatically, not emotionally charged, but calmly, respectfully, there's a quiet understanding that what happened here doesn't need to be repeated to matter. It simply exists now, as something real, something acknowledged, and something finally, peacefully understood.